Hi everyone. My name's Anna Thompson. I'm from Turner and Townsend. Turner and Townsend are an independent construction consultancy company. We work in 87 offices over 36 countries, so we have global experience. What we've found is, over recent years, is that obviously a number of government states across the globe have been mandating BIM in some way or form. And what they've been doing is looking actually towards the UK as best practice due to the level of development and research that's happened over recent years. So within T&T, we've actually been learning initially from our oil and gas teams. In our oil and gas sectors, we're finding that the designers for a number of years now have been creating 3D models that we're able to get quantities from. And then as governments and states have started to mandate BIM, we've developed this knowledge of quantification from 3D modelling into this kind of BIM methodology. And we now have a strong specialist BIM team across in the UK, and our team, including myself, support our clients in the UK and globally, where we design BIM strategies for clients and implement them. So what we're able to do is design these EIRs for our clients, put into place the BIM execution plan, run the BIM workshops and do the delivery. So Turner and Townsend over recent years have been developing our knowledge, our experience, our skills in a BIM environment to enable our cost managers and our project managers and our consulting FM team to be able to lead and operate in a BIM environment. So what we'll be covering? Well, in terms of the content of my presentation, we're just going to touch on the content and structure of an EIR document, the key activities that need to take place to enable the production of an EIR document, and what a good EIR contains. What should we be looking at? What should we be asking for? What should we be identifying as maybe missing from an EIR document if we do receive one? And key steps to a successful EIR document aligned to PAS 1192, which is obviously been developed in the UK, which Ralph has touched on. So, why and wherefore? PAS 11922 provides guidance for information management during the capital delivery phase associated with projects delivered using BIM. There's also PAS 11923, which looks at information management during the operational phase. But what is an EIR? Well, the EIR is the Employer's Information Requirement document. Why is it needed? It sets out the whats and whys of a project associated with the development of a building information model. Why is it required? It's required at the assessment and need phase. So right at the beginning of the project, we need to define what we require. How is it created? By formally identifying and documenting the client's needs. So it's all about the client's needs, the client's requirements. We've identified 7 steps to a successful BIM project, and we're focusing initially really on, if my laser is working, on this section here. But actually what sits above is what's called the OIR and EIR. And I don't know whether you're aware, but there is a BIM dictionary that's actually been published by Bon Bryan and gets updated because we've suddenly realised we're working in a world of lots of acronyms. So we have the OIR, which is the Organisational Information Requirement. It's looking at high-level organisational business objectives. And then that feeds down into the Asset Information Requirement document, the AIR. The one acronym I do like is PIM, because it reminds me of having a drink, but the rest of these don't. So the Asset Information Requirement document defines the client and information requirements at an organisational level. So what data is important to a client to be able to operate their assets. Now, that is all defined in PAS 11923. Now, we would love that to be in place, but what we're finding is a lot of projects, the clients are starting at this level with the EIR. So from down here, what's in blue is project level BIM requirements. What is above is more the operational phase. So in a perfect world, we'd like to see everything at the top here, but what we're finding is we're starting more at this level, which is fine because we're still learning. So the EIR defines the client's project and BIM objectives. What are they? How do they align to a client's business objectives? What value can BIM provide this client? And within the EIR, we identify that it should make reference to the CIC BIM protocols, which we'll touch on. But that provides a contractual mechanism to be able to operate in a BIM environment. It addresses designers sharing their models, developing their models to the relevant standards defined in the EIR. It addresses copyright and intellectual property issues. So that's a document that should be appended to all design team appointments in a BIM environment. What also needs to be included within the EIR is the BIM capability assessment. Everybody says they're an expert. We're all experts. We need to test that. We need to make sure that our supply chain can meet the requirements that we are going to define in our EIR document. And these three documents here, EIR, CIC BIM Protocols, Capability Assessment, go out at the beginning of the project to anyone tendering for work. So the EIR needs to be in place at the start of the project before any tendering or appointment activities start. The client is responsible for putting that EIR in place and including this in his tender documents. So it forms part of the tender documentation. So what changes really for a client? Well, it's giving us greater opportunity, it's giving the clients greater opportunity to understand and influence the emerging design. Past 11922, the client is obliged to define information requirements and format at the earlier project stages. They're obliged to manage this information or appoint an external information manager, which is what Ralph touched on earlier. A client may actually need to invest in training and technology to engage with the team. How does the client want to use the model after handover? I had a meeting recently with a client who has asked for level 2 BIM. There's no EIR document in place. The design team are putting into place a BIM execution plan aligned with what they think should happen, but no one from the client has communicated this. There's also been put into place, if I just jump back, the common data environment, which should be there on day one and should be owned and managed by the client before we put the BIM execution plan in place. And this client, I asked the question, where's the common data environment? Oh, we've got 4 projects. Great tool. That's been put into place by the lead designer. Great, no problem. What happens at the end of the project? I don't know. How does that information get handed over? I don't know. Are you going to carry on your contract with 4 projects? I don't know. The client hadn't really thought about anything. He hadn't thought about how he wanted to use the model and all this data in operations. I was going, what information is important to you in operations? What data do you want to see in the model? And they said, we want to use the model for FM purposes. Why? Do you have the tool sets, the ability to do this? Do you need to invest in training and technology to be able to view the model, take data out of the model? How does it interact with existing CAFM systems or systems that you have in place? The clients haven't really thought about this, and as we pointed out before, a lot of clients are just saying, I want BIM, or I want level 2 BIM, and they need us as professionals to provide them with advice and guidance as to what that actually means. So what does level 2 BIM mean? What does BIM mean to you? So clients may have to invest in training and technology to engage with the team as well. So we need to think about how data is going to be exchanged, how models are going to be exchanged and shared, who's using the models. We need to consider how it interfaces with existing and developing asset data. And the client needs to consider consultants' fee profiles may change. We're not seeing fees going up, but we're seeing fee profiles changing because the BIM methodology is encouraging us to do more work up front. What changes for the industry? Well, for our project team, the dynamics have slightly changed. We've got a few new people knocking around. We've got this information manager that we've been referring to, that is referred to in past 11922. You may get a BIM leader or a BIM project manager in place for the client. You'll have BIM managers, BIM coordinators working for the different design teams and maybe the contractor. And also, hopefully, facilities managers. Somebody that we've never really seen before in the dynamics of a project delivery team. There'll be different workflows, processes when implementing the BIM execution plan. The BIM execution plan is taken from the EIR document. Everything that in the EIR document feeds into the BIM execution plan, which we'll touch on in a minute. But the EIR document, the employer's information requirement, and the format of information will have to be defined at a much earlier stage, resulting in a long consultation phase at inception. So when the client says, I want BIM, we need to think about running BIM workshops with that client to actually define what they want. So one key activity to do on day one is, if you are the lead designer or you're the project manager, whoever the client approaches in the first port of call, and they start talking about BIM, it's being able to work with that client to be able to identify what BIM uses and value BIM can provide to them and what protocols need to be put into place. So information is going to be delivered in different formats. We're not going to be receiving lots of information in paper or PDFs or DWGs. The output has changed. The designers are using more intelligent tools. So the model is no different to a set of drawings in a specification document, but the output looks different and the way we're able to read and interpret that is different. More detailed design information control, which can be largely automated. So we're creating lots of data. And by creating lots of data in a BIM environment, that needs to be managed. So we need to think about how that is going to happen. So again, we need to address that in the EIR. And different formats of appointments. We touched on the CIC BIM protocols before. So what is an EIR? Well, EIRs are produced as part of a wider set of tender documents, is the best way to think about it, for use during procurement, both of the design team and of the contractor. So the EIR sets out clearly to the bidders the client's BIM objectives. Not I want BIM, but actually clearly defines the client's BIM objectives. What models are required? What level of detail do we require in the model at different stages? What is the purpose of the model? Or what will the purpose of the model be? So the development of the EIR starts either with the assessment of an existing asset, leading to the development of the of the employer's needs, or directly with the employer's needs if no existing asset or no asset information model is to be considered. So the EIR is really important. Without the creation of the EIR, we don't know what's going on. The EIR tells us what we are doing and why we are doing it. This defines what and the why of the project. So not just what the project objectives are, that we're trying to design a school, a hospital, a university building, and that's our brief, but actually what the model is going to be used for, what our BIM objectives are, how we're going to use BIM to drive value. And as we touched on before in the previous presentation, if we refer to PAS 11922, the EIR comes here. Not at the end, but right at the beginning. We're defining the what's and whys, the BIM objectives at the beginning. So the EIR should be created at the outset as it forms part of appointments and it forms part of our tender documents. What should be in the EIR? What is a standard kind of contents page look like? Well, the EIR includes the following as a minimum. So you've got your project information and your glossary, but there are three sections really: technical, management, commercial, and then the competency assessment. Within PAS 11922, the competency assessment falls within the commercial section. So, what's the standard structure? The EIR should cover three key areas. Technical, which includes aspects such as software platforms, data exchange formats, coordinations, level of detail, and training. So it's looking at what we call the model production delivery table. If I look at it from a cost management perspective, so my background is I'm a chartered quantity surveyor, so don't hold that against me. But at the beginning of a process, when we receive drawings or we receive a model, and we're creating an estimate, if I use a door as a simple analogy, our cost managers need to know it's a door and how many of those single doors there are. But as the design develops, we need more information. So we move into cost planning and bills of quantities. So what we're saying to the designers is, you know what, we don't expect to see everything in the model at the beginning of the process. But we do expect, as the model develops, to have more data attached to those objects. So BIM, the building information model, is very much like Lego. It's made up of objects. And those objects can have intelligent data attached to it. That data is important to other project stakeholders, to the client, to the cost manager, to the contractor, to the project managers, to health and safety advisors. And so we need to think about what data needs to go into the model at which stage. So the level of detail that we're looking to see the model being developed to for each stage. Management. What comes under management? Well, we need to identify, are we following any recognised BIM standards? Are we following the UK standards? Are we following something else? So are we following PAS 11922? Are we following BS 11924, which looks at data structure and COBie? Which standards are we following? Who has roles and responsibilities associated with this model? So the EIR isn't just defining what the client's BIM objectives are in terms of maybe reducing risk, improve coordination. It's actually looking at people's roles and responsibilities. Does the lead designer have a role and responsibility associated with not just designing, but also coordinating the different sub-models? So the architectural, structural, MEP, are they put together? Who does the checks? Who does that final coordination exercise? Does a client have a role and responsibility in a BIM environment? Yes, they have a role and responsibility to create the EIR, but maybe to put into place the common data environment for all project information to be exchanged on. Does a contractor have a role and responsibility associated with the development of the model? So we need to define who has a role and responsibility in the EIRs associated with the development of the model. We need to consider planning the works. So we need to think about a BIM implementation strategy, a BIM implementation plan. When will key BIM workshops be carried out? What outputs and outcomes are we looking for from those BIM workshops? And the key thing is, what are we actually using the model for? Who is going to be relying on this model? If we look at commercial is looking at that competency assessment. Does everybody have the capability to actually work in this BIM environment and achieve the outcomes that we're looking for? What data drops? At what point are we going to take data out of the model, and what data are we looking for? What are the project deliverables? So this is what the content of an EIR should look like. So it's not a case of just saying, I want BIM. So if we look at technical, proposed exchange formats. We're not saying that everyone has to use a particular software tool, but what we're saying is that in our BIM environment, you have to be able to exchange information in certain formats, whether that's IFC, DWFX, PDF, okay, NWC. So we need to identify that. And that needs to align with what the BIM users are, which I'll get onto in a minute. We also need to define the level of detail. So what we've got here, you can see an object is very straightforward. It's just an object. It's just a door to start with. But as we move through the different stages, you can see the level of detail associated with the model is more detailed. So we need to define that. We need to look at level of detail. We need to look at, in terms of management, you know what? These are amazing models. BIM in its simplest form is an amazing way of improving coordination and visualization, communicating to people design intent, helping people to make much more concise decisions earlier on in the process. But BIM is so much more intelligent than that. So yes, the designers can put lots of data into the model, but how does this align with our BIM objectives? How does it align to the BIM users that we want to see the model being used for and the outcomes? Who is going to actually utilise and rely on the model? So I've mentioned a couple of times BIM users. And the model can be used, as I said, not just for coordination and visualisation, but much more intelligently. I always refer to the I in BIM as being intelligence. So the model can be used for creating initial mass models, communicating floor usage, being able to work out floor areas. The model can then be developed and be used to look at pedestrian simulation, lighting analysis. It can be used for cost estimation. We can look at sun and shade analysis. We can use it for coordination. The contractors and PMs can break the model down and use software such as Naviswork to be able to create and formulate program sequencing. It's all about testing building performance in a virtual environment. So we're building on this computer before we actually build in real life. Now that's an intelligence that we haven't had. So we want to use it to our advantage to drive the value for our clients. But yes, there's lots and lots of things we could use the model for. But for a client, they may not all drive value and efficiency and meet the client's objectives. So we need to think about which of these BIM uses drives the most value for our client, and we need to define them in the EIR document. So do we want to see the models being able to be used for cost estimation and management? Do we want to see the models being used for coordination and sequencing? So testing in a virtual environment, those time solutions to come up with the optimum program and time solution. Does the client want to use the model for asset management? If they don't, there's no point in making sure lots of information goes into the model if it's not going to be worthwhile. From a cost manager's perspective, cost managers can use the model to improve the speed and accuracy of cost analysis, quantification, improve the reaction time to design change, provide a resource for a what-if analysis, so helping with value management exercises. But, as I always say, the design team can't read your mind. So the client needs to identify what the BIM uses are. I always use the analogy that I always think the design team are like my husband. I like to think he can read my mind, but he can't. So when he doesn't do his chores on a Saturday afternoon and he's off out on his mountain bike, and I'm left to sort everything out, I'm questioning why. It's because I didn't communicate it to him. I thought he could read my mind. So the EIR document's very like that. We're identifying at the beginning of the process what we want, why we want it, and what our expectations are of everybody. So as a cost manager, we communicate to the design team what data is important to us. I don't assume that a designer understands what data is important to us. So when they're putting their models together, knowing that the cost manager is going to use the model or that a client's going to use the model, I'm assuming they really know what level of information I want at the different stages. So from a cost management perspective, people need to communicate back up to the client when the EIR is being developed and to the design team what level of information we expect to see in the model. The EIR also needs to include that supply chain assessment, and from the UK, as we touched on before, the UK have developed lots of documents, standards, guidance that you can download for free. One of them is PAS 91, a great document with a selection of quite straightforward questions to include in that initial PQQ. So you can download that. There's also CPICS. CPICS breaks it down a bit further. It looks at more of a BIM assessment, an IT assessment, a resources assessment. So it goes into a lot more detail. Again, free and downloadable, easy to include within your tender documents, within the EIR document. Examples of EIR documents, free and downloadable. The UK's BIM Task Group, there's one available. BIM for Real have also created one. But it looks like you're going to get your own. So obviously out for public consultation at the moment. But what we're finding is a lot of this is aligning back to UK standards. So globally, clients and governments have actually been looking back at the UK as being best practice at the moment, because they've actually spent the time over the past 5 years developing their understanding, their knowledge of a BIM environment and identifying expectations. So projects where the clients ask for BIM, there's no EIR document, and then everyone's been left to put into place a BIM execution plan. How does the BIM execution plan be formulated if you don't know what your client's BIM objectives are? If you don't know who's got a role and responsibility? A BIM execution plan is very much just like a project execution plan. It's a process management tool. It's taking what our objectives are and putting it into a process management methodology. The EIR informs the BIM execution plan. So that is why the EIR is important. Otherwise, people will produce BIM execution plans based on what they think the client means by BIM. So once the EIR is being produced, it's distributed to tender project teams who determine its requirements and implications, creating strategies for achieving them and compiling this in a form of a pre-contract BIM execution plan. But it's important to note, if the EIR hasn't been created effectively and does not include specific BIM requirements, it's impossible for a project team to create an effective BIM execution plan. They're just second guessing. They're doing what they think they should be doing, but no one's told them. So, what does a good BIM look like? Well, a good BIM complies to the EIR documents. A good BIM and a successful BIM project works because we've put in protocols and mechanisms and processes to help people operate in that BIM environment. So the EIR is key to a successful BIM project. What we don't want, I always call this kind of a level 1 BIM project, where the design team are using BIM software, and that's great, but there's not a lot of thought going into how people are going to use that model, rely on that model, utilize that model, what data, what level of information should be going in. It's really being used for coordination purposes. What we want is a clear set of BIM protocols. We want models being created that can be shared and used by others. So we have a usable model that aligns with the EIR documents. It meets the client's business objectives as well as their BIM objectives. And we have a team who work much more efficiently, driving value for our clients in terms of time, cost, and quality. So the EIR needs to inform the CIC BIM Protocol document, and I always think this is one of our most important documents. Otherwise, you'll end up working in a BIM environment, and if this hasn't been incorporated, designers can all of a sudden say, I'm not going to share my model. I'm reluctant to share it because I didn't know what you're going to use it for. People are going to be relying on the model for accuracy. They've also got issues with copyright, intellectual property. Now, this document's the best we've got at the moment, and that's why it's being used. But it sets out the roles and responsibilities. The EIR informs the CIC BIM protocols. It talks about roles and responsibilities. It talks about level of detail required in the model. But as I said, it addresses copyright and IPR issues. And it should be appended to the team's appointments. So rather than a team's appointment, a designer being appointed saying, we want you to design us a school, and this is your scope of service, a standard scope of service, and we want BIM, this is actually telling us what we mean by we want BIM. And so it forms part of the contract. So, conditions to success. Well, in the UK, we use all these documents. The PAS 11922, PAS 11923, BS 11924, which is data structure, CIC protocols. But what we also do from a cost management perspective, and in the UK we have NRM, we're communicating as cost managers as well what our expectations are of the model. Rather than receiving it and go, oh, I'm going to have to spend loads of time validating it and checking it, I'm not comfortable with the quants coming out of it. And so we're communicating as cost managers back up the chain what our expectations are. So a successful BIM project needs the EIR in place to start with, and then a BIM execution plan following that, and used throughout the process to manage the project in a BIM environment. So 4 conditions for success. What are the employer's BIM objectives and associated BIM uses? You want to be able to help and advise your client in that environment. What are the needs of different project stakeholders? Are other people going to be relying on that model to be a true representation of design and construct intent? And by that I mean we have scenarios where we receive models and the designers have created a model which looks great, visually it looks great, but it has issues in it, such as an analogy I often use is that concrete column. Multi-storey building, there's a column runs straight through as one object, and then the floor's cut through. So we've got quantification issues to start with. The contractors and project managers, if they take that model and want to break it down, have an issue because it's just got one big object, one column. So the designers haven't thought about how the model needs to be constructed that other people are going to be using it. And it's a big learning curve at the moment. If they printed out plans and sections from that model, that problem, that issue would never have been brought up. We would never notice that. And we'd carry on in our traditional methods. So it's about communicating, it's about testing and working together. We often invite in Turner and Townsend the design team in and say, give us a little bit of a trial model and I'll show you what we can see in the software we use. And instantly the designers will go, all right, get that. Yeah, I can see. Yeah, that's easy. We can rectify that. But if no one tells them this at the beginning of the process, then garbage in is garbage out. Okay? The model's only as good as the information in it. Who has a role and responsibility associated with the development of the model? Is it just the design team? Is the contractor going to have to take any responsibility for continuing that development of the model during construction? In a BIM environment, who's putting into place the common data environment? Who's going to manage that environment? And then finally, the CIC BIM Protocol document. I'd just like to thank you for your time. I hope you enjoyed that. But any questions and we'll catch up at the end.